The 5 W's of Black Lives Matter. This is the third entry in the Black Lives Matter series that I'm doing. I will be reading from a blog post that I initially posted on July 20th, 2016, and adding some recent observations and information as it fits. At the time of the initial posting, I had began by discussing the horrific terrorist attack that had occurred on July 14th, 2016 in Nice, France. This was the Bastille Day celebrations where somebody drove a truck through the crowd, killing, I think, upwards of 60 people, if I'm not mistaken. It struck me rather deeply for several reasons, many of them in context to the current behavior of Black Lives Matter, and that behavior has continued since then. In what I will not call a coincidence, since there is a prevalence of at least finding out about these attacks, even if the actual number of them hasn't increased. If you count actual numbers, it has increased since there's more people, but if you count overall safety, I would also say that has increased. And I still make the case that we are safer today than we have been in the past. And I'm recording this with the knowledge that this is happening right after the worst mass shooting in modern US history that occurred in Las Vegas, Nevada, killing about 58 people. In 2016, I had a flight to Nairobi on the next day, and I was slowly getting the news in as it came out, the news of the Nice attack. I had multiple errands to run, some blog posts to edit, feature plans to ponder, and more, and then here was the news of an occasion where people were targeted to ensure that they would never have another tomorrow, another flight, another errand, or another thought. Today I'm recording this in Nairobi, and still thankful that I still have the ability to think. I'm still following the news of both a perplexing attack and trying to make sense of the motives of the people in the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2016, I was reading a live updating news article about the attack, and I read the comment section, and it contained some black humor, the kind of general ones where expecting calls for bans on all automatic trucks or common sense truck control, in mockery of some of the rhetoric following incidents where murders are carried out primarily by the use of firearms. The perpetrators in Nice had used a truck, and once the truck came to a stop, they jumped out and had firearms and started shooting at the crowd. Today, with the Vegas attack, the rhetoric continues. This one was completely with guns. Sure, he must have used vehicles and other things to get to the location, to get the guns to the location, but the killing itself was done primarily, solely with guns. So, part of the discussion is about bump stocks, silencers, the right kind of background tests before you get these weapons. And I don't necessarily see the relevance it would have had to actually stopping the incident or attack. In fact, some of the people advocating for this do admit that it had little to do with what was actually done, as he did not use any silencers and passed the background checks that were there already. But I've come across a few articles that cover this Vegas things and kind of put some of my thoughts and ideas towards it in a lot better way than I can here, and I'll leave links below to those. So getting back to the topic of Black Lives Matter, similar things that happen in these general attacks occur within issues that Black Lives Matter seems to take a lot of concern with. Lives are lost, demands are made, and confusion remains. So many comments following incidents such as these are of anger and condemnation, and fewer do you find any that are surprised. In 2016, I posted a link to a story on social media after the attack, without any comment. I shared the news of it with my flatmate and felt emotions building up as we discussed it, and shortly after, the image of this little girl covered in this safety type of blanket looked like foil of some sorts. So after a while, I was able to collect my thoughts enough to write a blog post, and I posted that up. After the recent Vegas shooting, I recorded a video and shared some of my thoughts on it. That does seem to be the general nature of things. Something happens, you collect yourself, you try to make sense out of it, and you try to move forward. So, in this series of posts discussing Black Lives Matter claiming to riot for the kinds of deaths that are by a vast majority self-inflicted within the black community, when others remain relatively silent as they are clearly targeted. At the time of the Nice attack, a confusing mix of revulsion, pity, anger, and more set in as I consider the details that were soon to emerge and the reactions and behavior that would follow. The death toll began to rise as the videos and images were posted. Identification of the terrorists and some other victims followed shortly. Then began the calls to not judge a group by the actions of a few. These calls made by the same kind of people that would condone assigning guilt for incidents that were far more nebulous to a single group, and that use the not all insert preferred group technique freely. And a timely example of this actual thing happening is the situation in Vegas. The shooter has been identified so far to be a white male in his 60s, and this is being used by some as an example of toxic white male masculinity and how it needs to be checked in the United States of America. Again, this bears repeating. I remain confident of an ongoing paradigm shift. It is horrific and perhaps inevitable that it comes with such death and carnage, but this is what we have to live with. Even in the present light of this still baffling to many shooting in Las Vegas, my confidence remains. The world, for pretty much anyone you can think of, especially if you're listening to this, is as good a place to live in that has ever been. For now, back to the topic at hand. I will apply the 5Ws technique of inquiry to the Black Lives Matter movement's actions after the 2016 deaths on July 5th and 6th of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. Here is a short description of what the 5Ws are. The 5Ws are often mentioned in journalism, research, and police investigations. They constitute a formula for getting the complete story on a subject. According to the principle of the 5Ws, a report can only be considered complete if it answers these questions, starting with an interrogative word. What happened? Who did that? When did it take place? Where did it take place? Why did that happen? Some authors add a sixth question, how, to the list, though how can also be covered with what, when, or where. And that question would be, how did it happen? I really like these 5Ws, or 6Ws if you include the W at the end of how. As is often the case, I have been using this process for years before learning its technical term, and many of you could possibly say the same. So now I'm going to apply those 5Ws or 6Ws to Black Lives Matter in the two cases I had mentioned. What happened? Videos of two black males that were shot dead. They were later identified to have been armed, but were not brandishing their weapons. The officers at the time had knowledge that they had possession of those weapons. The deaths via firearm of non-blacks, or black deaths at the hands of black shooters, are routinely ignored by Black Lives Matter. Therefore, a takeaway from this is Black Lives Matter does not take issue solely with black deaths or guns. On to the next W. Who did that? A figure of authority ended lives. Then powerless and oppressed protested. This is at least what I saw many people portray it as. And this isn't a case of white policemen, since in the case of Philando Castile, the officers were of Latino and Asian ethnicity. Now, I don't think this Asian is going to fall into that whole white Asian classification that was given to George Zimmerman, but using that George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin example, he was also not a police officer, yet Black Lives Matter took it as a situation to protest. Black Lives Matter states that blacks have no power. Under that premise, black-on-black violence has no focal point for protest. If the who was a case of white versus black, then the active white participation in protests would likely be framed as threatening and unwelcome. There's also the frequent declaration from Black Lives Matter that people who were intended to protect us are killing us. Take note of this point. On to the next W. When did it take place? The deaths of Castile and Sterling were on July 5th and 6th, this being on the 4th of July holiday weekend or holiday time, and people were relatively free and focused on the state of the nation. So video and images of the incidents began to spread across social media after this patriotic holiday. This also coming during a very tense election season. It also led to several protests on July 7th that increased in number over the next few days. I heard no calls discouraging sharing the visuals related to these two deaths on social networks. Whereas with the Nice terror attacks, there were several calls of people being requested to self-censor. The protests following the deaths of Castile and Sterling were so intense that they lasted through the shooting of several police officers during a protest in Dallas, Texas. So on to the next W. Where did this take place? The death of Castile in Falcon Heights, Minnesota, and of Sterling in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, resulted in protests in several cities in North America and Europe. This fits to the claim of Black Lives Matter that they are not focused on one localized issue, but instead a systematic and widespread one. On to the next W. Why did it happen? I find this question of why to be part of the main reason I decided to make this series. And to achieve the goal of this post, I needed to find out why the two that died came to be in contact with the police in the first place. Black Lives Matter doesn't seem to care about the recent whys of the incidents. They saw the video and reacted to it, which indicates that it could be associated to some other issue or issues. In fact, many consider that asking questions like why, who, what, or any of these 6 W's are racist or, in the very least, inappropriate. On to the next W. How did it happen? Protests, condemnations, and other sort of reactions had occurred way before you could actually find out why the 2 men were shot, how anyone got there, or much of the pertinent information to this. This is actually more evidence to what I'll actually provide as being the central issue behind Black Lives Matter and related protests and movements, which is actually an indefensible issue. If the how or why mattered, then Black Lives Matter would not be using the hands up, don't shoot thing. This coming from the Mike Brown situation that has since been thoroughly discounted, but they still use it as a slogan. They still have it on their shirts, they still have it in their communication, they still have it in other merchandise. People in or supportive of Black Lives Matter will often state that this slogan is still used because it raises the conversation and brings attention to an important systemic issue that has existed since before slavery. If the problem was truly so widespread and prevalent, they would have found something else to use as a more concrete example. That's not really addressed. So the 6 W's are over, and what do we get from that? It was deaths by authorities, happening in different locations, close together in time, and the who and how don't really seem to matter too much when you actually talk about details of the issues. So Black Lives Matter claims that whites should speak out, which I do agree with, which may come as a surprise to some of you who have listened to my previous video on how I discussed white silence being one of the unholy trinity of lies. I'm referring, though, to the existence of what may accurately be defined as white noise when it comes to discussing how people in the Black and other communities are parented, if at all parented. The if at all part is key, as the prevalence of abortions in the African American community is staggering, some figures stating it's up to 1,876 a day. Now, of the children that have the privilege of making it through gestation and are born, 75% plus of them find themselves in a single-parent household. I feel the need to make the point that this is a percent, so it doesn't mean that if you have 100 Black women giving birth, 75% of them will be single mothers. But as is true with many social ills and failures and problems, you find situations where people are repeat offenders. So many of these children will be born into houses with multiple children, further stretching the limited time and resources that this individual or parent has to give to each child. Choosing to have a child while single, which is single parenthood, versus having a spouse or significant other die, which is being a widow or widower, indicates questionable decision-making capabilities. What is it about contemporary African American or Black culture that results in this horrific scourge of broken families? From observations, the prevalence of single parenthood in Kenya is nowhere close to that I've found in the United States of America. Some anecdotal evidence being a recent discussion with a new father who specifically pointed out that he did not want the father of the mother of his child and future wife to think that the child they had was an accident or unwanted. This man in question had been raised by his father after his birth mother left shortly after he was born. This also goes against the whole "I was raised this way, so I'll repeat it" defense, which also would not apply to the first generation that was born from a 2-parent household that chose to be single parents. Though in this case he may not be legally or ceremonially married, but that child is not in a single parent household. Even within the African American community, you can expect to see differences in single parenthood rates between recent immigrants and generational Americans. So even the access to welfare and other things that might subsidize the cost of single motherhood are equally available to both. There's something about their cultures that changes it. So broken families are not reserved to any ethnicity or group, and the negative consequences, be they from physical, verbal, or mental abuse, such as neglect and striking your child, that exist within these broken single-parent families are increasingly undeniable. Black Lives Matter participants fit the mold of victims whom, unable to face their actual tormentors, superficially the white devil, and in reality their childhood abusers, lash out at easier targets. This is similar to how terrorists, unable to lash out at their actual tormentors, not so superficially governmental and state agents, target the soft targets considered complicit citizens, instead of their childhood tormentors. Many listening to this will be familiar with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and the effects that an adult can have from just seeing visuals of a terror attack or the deaths of Sterling and Castile, let alone experiencing them in person. So there are people who are able to look at an adult, an older person, or entire cultures and say, look, these people or persons with their higher functioning capabilities have been affected by these violent actions in the past. Yet when it comes to children, they seem unable to understand that the effects of child abuse can have an immense effect. What are its connections to the high criminality and poverty rates within the black community? The ability of past actions to affect present behavior is a core aspect to the claim of historical or systemic racism and oppression. If a policeman is shot, it's thus retribution for their past abuses of power or a system that tells them and makes them do these negative things. However, if you bring up a recently deceased black person's history of criminal activity, they say that it's circumstantial at best. So does this line of inquiry into one's lifetime hit somewhat too close to home? Kind of inching towards nothing they could possibly have done justify this treatment area. Because are you saying that as a child, or that any child could have done something to deserve the beatings that they receive? Could they not see that the child was giving up? That the child was asking, what did they do wrong? That it hurt the child? Systemic and or historical oppression makes the claim that what a person did 3 hours, days, or years before is subject to things that others did 300 years ago. I see this as somebody who's able to understand that there's a great lack of control over what happens during somebody's childhood, and what happens during that childhood can have a lasting effect on their present self. So back to the point I suggested you should take note of from the W of who did this. We can all agree with Black Lives Matter when they say that those that are supposed to protect should be held accountable when they hurt or kill. Now, those that agree with this statement, I ask you, who can justifiably expect more protection than a child does from their parental figures? And what are the implications of the prevalence of child abuse? So when I see Black Lives Matter participants, supporters, and members claiming that the abuse of authority is their main issue, that may indicate to me that they're aware of the horror, but as yet unable to process the actual roots of which these problems stem from. Possibly they're close to, or even worse, as far as they can get to facing the large part of the answer to, if not the sole answer to, how all this happened, which is child mistreatment and abuse. So enough silence on this matter. It is something that needs to be discussed. All cultures and peoples that have done so, that have discussed child abuse and reduced it, have benefited from it. So that comes to an end of the introductory part of the Black Lives Matter series. As I said, the movement is still going on, and this kind of sets the foundation of how I'm approaching it. So I'll still be discussing different topics related to Black Lives Matter, but with this as a basis, where I'm thinking basis of many of the evils in the world, if not all the evils in the world, come with how we treat our children, how societies and cultures treat the children. Because I don't think people are born evil or inherently better or worse than one another. They just have different abilities, and they can be shaped and molded according to the guidance and lack of guidance that they receive in their early years. So let me know what you guys thought. If you haven't seen the other videos in this series, please check them out. Like, share, and subscribe. Also, links below to a store where I'm selling merchandise and other stuff related to this channel to help me support this and just keep creating this content. So till next video, this is Silas, and goodbye.